Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Catherine Tate brings her sketch show character to the big screen in the Nan Movie, which has a surprisingly complicated production history. When foul-mouthed Nan Joni Taylor, played by Catherine Tate, receives a letter from her estranged sister Nell, played by Katherine Parkinson, telling her that Nell is dying, her grandson Jamie, played by Matthew Horne, takes her on a road trip, even if Joni is reluctant to see her. As they make their way from London to Ireland, getting into all sorts of wild mishaps along the way, Joni reveals to Jamie her past and how during World War II she and Nell were competing for the affections of American GI Walter, played by Parker Sawyers, which would lead to her becoming the cantankerous old Nan we all know. British TV's film adaptations have long been a mainstay of the local industry, ever since the 1970s when movie versions of hit shows like Monty Python, Dad's Army, Rising Damp, Step-Turned Son and The Sweeney, among many others, hit the big screen. But it got a major resurgence in the last decade thanks to the success of the In-Betweeners movies. Those films were such huge local hits that suddenly everyone wanted a spin-off movie, and the result is some of the worst films I have ever seen on a cinema screen. I have never seen as many people walk out of a cinema as the time I went and saw Keith Lemon the film on opening weekend. And other such illustrious examples in the subgenre include the Harry Hill movie and the notorious Mrs. Brown's Boys the movie. And the latest in the long line of these is the Nan Movie, which is a spin-off of the Catherine Tate sketch show character that originated in 2004 and was so successful that she got a series of spin-off specials, the last of which aired in 2015. Those specials are written by Tate and her former writing partner Brett Goldstein, and this movie is credited to them, although as I'll get into, that writing credit is a little bit murky, to say the least. But nevertheless, Goldstein has gone to have enormous success in America thanks to Ted Lasso and recently getting cast in the MCU as Hercules. But the main attraction here is meant to be Tate, even though the Nan character hasn't been relevant for years, although in the movie's defense, that 7-year gap between the last special is partly down to the fact this was meant to be out in the summer of 2020, June to be precise. It was meant to be a bit of summer counter-programming while the football was on, but of course COVID scuppered that, and the movie sat on the shelf for at least several years until it finally came out thanks to Warner Brothers releasing it in March of 2022. And I actually did see the movie when it came out at the time, but I never got round to officially reviewing it, and I kind of thought, well, it doesn't really matter because it's never coming out in America. These things almost never do because they're so local. They have no international appeal whatsoever. And then it turned out this movie was actually getting released in America. Luckily, Americans get to see this absolute catastrophe for themselves because this is the Justice League of British TV to film spin-offs. You see, there's one major thing about the Nan Movie: there is no director's credit on the final version of this film. Nothing. Nada. Not an Anne Smithy, not a pseudonym, there's no directed by credit on it at all. The closest thing you'll find is a Catherine Tate film as a credit, which technically is not a director's credit, but it gives you a good idea of who shepherded this to completion. Nevertheless, the only other film that I can think of that has had no director's credit when released was Wonder Park, and that movie had a director that was fired for harassment. This isn't how this project was originally conceived. The movie was filmed under the title of This Nan's Life, and the original director was Josie Rourke, who is a respected theatre director in the UK, and she recently moved into film with the movie Mary, Queen of Scots. It was going to be telling the story of how this cantankerous, sweary Nan that we all know came to be, and it had a maybe slightly tragic story about it, and certainly there was more of a dramatic angle underpinning the comedy in the original conception of the movie. The flashbacks were going to be the majority of the film, with only the current day scenes really being a kind of wraparound, at least as I understand the production. This was according to Bleeding Cool, who got a few industry sources that told them a few things having seen the final version of the movie. And I'm only kind of piecing it together from what's actually still left in the film, and a couple of photos that I've managed to dig up that Rourke posted on her Instagram. And certainly, it doesn't seem like Rourke left the project on particularly good terms, because all of those Instagram posts have been deleted. Apparently what happened is they showed the original version of the movie to the producers, who suddenly went, hang on a minute, that's not the movie that we paid for. And I guess in some way I kind of empathise with the investors, because if you put your money in a film called the Nan Movie, then chances are you're probably thinking of exactly what the final finished version of the movie is. Unfortunately, that's lowest common denominator trash, but at least it's recognisably the lowest common denominator trash that you paid for. As a result, Rourke was booted from the project, and Tate wrote a whole bunch of new material to be hastily reshot on the cheap to massively expand out the modern day road trip segments of the movie so that they became the main narrative, not the flashbacks, which were weed-whacked down to about 20 minutes of the final 94-minute running time. Now, I can't say for certain that's the entirety of Rourke's material that was retained in the final version of the movie, because I did actually find a photo from the old Instagram feed of Rourke posing with Tate in full makeup with Matthew Horne in front of the van that their characters drive in through much of the movie. So she did actually film some of the present day scenes as well, and I think some of those are also in the movie, but clearly it's a fairly low amount if Rourke managed to get her name taken entirely off of the final version of the movie, and I would estimate that maybe a third of it is Rourke's work overall. That means that a lot of this movie was heavily retooled in post, and really that reflects on the final product, because as you're watching it you can feel that the movie is being pulled in two completely different directions, and certainly when it goes into the flashback sequences it feels like you're watching a completely different movie. Rourke was known for creating really great period productions, and while clearly there wasn't a huge amount of money to begin with, certainly it looks very handsomely mounted, it looks very tastefully shot. In fact, at some moments it almost borders on artistic, because there is actually one moment where Joni is actually putting makeup on in a mirror, but the mirror has a crack down it, so Nell is on the other side of that crack. You know, kind of neat, gives you that kind of visual separation of the characters. My goodness, it's almost like a director that kind of knew what they were doing and was at least trying to do something with the material. I would argue that the other reason why the producers rejected all this flashback stuff is that honestly, a lot of it is played straight. It's not overtly played for comedy. In fact, it more works as drama than it does comedy. And I think that is probably what would have been the main stumbling block, because that's, again, not what you think of when you think of the character. But again, it seems to me that this was an attempt to at least try and do something a little bit ambitious that was just completely quashed. Unfortunately, these flashback scenes are wrapped in a turd sandwich. And I know that's crude, but that's basically the description these modern day road trip scenes deserve, essentially being bodily functions gags. Pee, poo and farts for 70 straight minutes. It is bottom of the barrel stuff. And Catherine Tate is a talented actor and comedian, but you never know it from watching this, which just leans into all of her worst traits as a performer. And the Nan character is so annoying to watch on screen. She is shrill and obnoxious. She's got this machine gun laugh. But that's exactly the way that she was designed to be, because she's meant to be a caricature of a lot of people's nans that have kind of grown too old to actually care what anyone thinks about them. So I'll just say what's ever on the top of their head, or say something that's very politically incorrect, and just really act out and swear all the time. And that can work because sketch characters are meant to work in fairly brief bursts, but 90 minutes of it is far too much. And Tate knows this. I'm sure she knows this, because she conceived the movie to try and work around that fact, to try and add a bit of nuance to the character, to actually make it sustain that kind of length, and then she was told, no, go back to the old stuff, which I guess she gladly did. And as a result, the character just feels like she's completely overexposed by the running time. And also, the movie has to do this weird thing where a character that clearly was never meant to be likeable, we have to kind of like her, so the movie's really straining hard to make her in some way sympathetic, even though literally the opening credits of the movie is her walking through a market in London where she's meeting a bunch of people, and then as soon as they leave the frame, curses them out or insults them behind their back. Like, it's that kind of character. We weren't meant to empathise completely with the modern version of the character. We were meant to empathise with who she was. And that has obviously completely changed when the movie got retold. And it's kind of ironic that the movie has ended up being exactly the thing it was trying to counter against in the first place. It was trying not to be a cheap cash-in on the material already, but that's exactly what it is. I can count exactly 2 gags that I laughed at in the Nan movie, and they both happened in the first 10 minutes. The first is when Nan buys a statue of Robert Mugabe from a market stall in the opening credits, confusing him for newscaster Trevor McDonald. Again, that's a joke that's really going to translate very well overseas, but nevertheless, that did get a laugh out of me. Even though the prop is incredibly cheap looking, it looks like a school project. The other gag that I laughed at is technically a running gag, where Jamie is running a crafts operation out of his van for people with mental illness. This is all basically a setup for the fact that on the side of the van, it has the slogan, "Crafts undo negative thinking." Think about the acronym for that, although you don't have to really think all that hard, because the gag is that it's printed on the side where the door is, so that when the door opens, it reveals what the acronym is. And of course, that gets used so many times that very quickly that gag stops being funny. But aside from those 2 gags, the rest of the movie is just a catalogue of ineity that is brutally unfunny and barely even structured. Niky Wardley reprises her role from the spin-off specials alongside Horne and Tate as basically Nan's nemesis, who was busted down to being a traffic warden. And she tries to get revenge on Nan through much of the movie, following them from Liverpool to Ireland. And this is a subplot that makes no sense whatsoever, because she has no jurisdiction in Ireland. None whatsoever. But she kind of occasionally spots Nan in the act, but it's a character that could have easily been written out of the script. She does virtually nothing, and half the time she's barely even in the movie. She just kind of drifts in and out whenever. I don't know if she was from the original conception of this movie and she couldn't come back for the reshoots, but nevertheless, it is a complete mess, this particular subplot, and actually goes totally nowhere. And then there's comic set pieces that feel really heavily derivative of things we've seen numerous times before. There's a sequence where Nan stumbles out and goes partying with a bunch of Australian rugby players, and she mixes up a heart medication with pills, and way! Haven't seen that in a billion other comedies. There's a moment in that sequence which really shows how sloppily this movie was filmed and assembled, in that Jamie wakes up at 4 in the morning and realises that she's missing and goes running out on the streets of Liverpool after her, and those streets are filled with people at 4 in the morning. But of course, it isn't 4 in the morning, it's probably early evening in the winter, and there are people doing Christmas shopping, and that's why they're all out on the streets. But no, don't take any consideration of when the scene is supposed to be set, where the streets are probably going to be empty at that time, and the movie is filled with all kinds of those sloppy mistakes all throughout it. One of the worst things is clearly something that was added when they recut the movie, because they clearly didn't have enough money to film all the stuff they wanted to when they restructured it, so there are animated sequences that kind of bridge together gaps in the film. It's exactly as bad as you think it is. In fact, it's worse, because you haven't seen the animation in those sequences. They're essentially crude still shots of the movie, kind of vaguely animated. Like, it's meant to look intentionally bad, but it's not funny. It just looks abysmal. I was watching it on a cinema screen going, I can't believe I'm watching this on a cinema screen. And I know the gag is meant to be, oh, well, he's got a YouTube channel and he's got his little animations about his nan, but of course, that's a thing that was added later, and that's purely there to justify it, because there's literally an ADR conversation where she goes, oh, you're still making those YouTube shorts, are you?
You're still drawing your cartoons?
They're animations, Nan.
And so several minutes of the movie are devoted to action sequences that look like they were rendered by a 6-year-old, and really ask the question, this was considered to be releasable by Warner Brothers, no less? And that's before the movie even gets to Ireland, which is really where it starts making some questionable decisions, to say the least. One of which is when they arrive in Dublin, they soon meet a man named Mick, who tags along with them, and eventually reveals himself as being a vegan terrorist. Yes, really. So a weird little subplot running through the movie is that Joni loves these processed chicken finger snacks, the kind you can get out of a fridge at a supermarket, and Jamie's appalled about it because of the conditions of the chickens. And later in the film, and I guess culminating this arc, Joni tags along with Mick to an industrial chicken farm. They're literally handcuffed together, and she helps him free the chickens before blowing up the farm. It is a sequence that is a complete cul-de-sac. It just goes nowhere and really has nothing to do with anything else in the rest of the movie, but it just feels like it's there because someone said, hey, we need an Irish character in the movie. What if we had a character that deliberately evokes the memory of IRA bombers, but a nice one, because he's fighting for the animals. He's a good guy. Yeah, I was completely dumbfounded by this sequence, especially because it's in rather dubious taste, to say the least. But if you thought that was a bizarrely offensive turn of events, wait until you get to the ending. Obviously, spoiler alert, as if you actually care, but Nan does actually make it to Nell at the end of the movie on an island off the coast of Ireland. Say that very quickly, why don't you? So they're making up for lost time. And speaking of makeup, the makeup on Catherine Parkinson and Parker Sawyers during this sequence is dreadful. But then again, when you think about it, I'm not sure there's any way of actually making them up convincingly, because if you even remotely think about the timeline of this movie, Nan and all the other characters from the World War II stuff must surely be about 90 to 100 years old in the present day. I don't think the movie actually considers that at any point. Parkinson is a really decent performer who deserves much better material than this, but she tells Nan that Walter is upstairs because he's got a secret to tell her. And he comes down, and it turns out that he is a cross-dresser. He likes to wear women's clothing, and he is in a full dress. And at this point, my jaw almost literally hit the floor. I was flummoxed beyond belief, because I couldn't believe that in the year 2022, we're apparently still having comedies where the big twist punchline at the end of them is man in a dress. Seriously? In this day and age? In this political climate? No less? I mean, at the worst reading of this reads like a transphobic dog whistle. Yes, the filmmakers go out of their way to clarify that no, Walter is not trans, he identifies as he, him. Even so, it still feels very perilously close to a lot of really nasty stuff about the trans community. And on top of that, even in the most charitable reading of it, it still is presented like it's some kind of ironic comeuppance for Nell for stealing Walter in the first place, that, oh, on her wedding night, he suddenly drops this bombshell, and it's like this kind of karmic punishment for her stealing him in the first place. Like, this is so egregiously misguided, it almost made my head explode. I was genuinely left at a loss for words by this ending, because I knew the film was retrograde trash, but I wasn't aware it was this retrograde, and it feels like the kind of offensive, outdated stereotyping that would have seemed so even back in 2004 when the character originated. But sure enough, the movie left the absolute worst for last. So in summary, the Nan movie is just as dire as you'd expect it to be given the notorious reputation of British TV to film spin-offs, and understandable why Josie Rourke has almost entirely wiped her name off of the film, except for one executive producer credit. Now I don't know what the original version of this movie was like, and I doubt anyone's going to be starting a hashtag release the Rourke cut anytime soon, but the finished version of the movie is genuinely quite depressing. It is literally Catherine Tate's answer to Dirty Grandpa, right down to a sequence where Jamie wakes up to be greeted to Nan literally farting in his face. And the thing is, the movie wasn't designed to be like this. It did aspire to be something more than that, but then Tate had to suddenly regress as a performer, and it's just embarrassing to watch. The movie is basically a case of cinematic dementia. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or with YouTube's Super Thanks feature, or even treat yourself to some merch at my brand new TeePublic page. Or you can give me a tea and a biscuit at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Burke, fading out.